Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is Intifada. They're calling it the Silent Intifada. In Arabic, some are referring to it as the Automobile Intifada or the Car Intifada. This is certainly a period of rioting and unrest in the Middle East, especially in Jerusalem. And over the past few weeks, the level of intensity of violence has waxed and waned. The word intifada, though, is a hard word to translate. Most people just say uprising, resistance, or rebellion. The root in Arabic actually means to shake off, even to shake up, to awaken, to get someone to stand up when they're sleeping. That's where the word intifada comes from. The word was first used in 1965 to describe politics. It was in Bahrain when leftists rose up against the British colonial power. In 1970, the term was used again as the Zemla Intifada. This time it was against the Spanish in the Sahara. Intifada became the best-known term to describe what was happening between 1987 and 1993 between the Palestinians and the Israelis. It was called now, in history, it's called the First Palestinian Intifada. Now, the immediate cause of the First Intifada, or uprising, came actually on December 8th, when an Israeli army truck ran into a group of Palestinians near Jabalia refugee camp in the Gaza Strip, killing 4 and injuring 7. Earlier, a Jewish salesman had been stabbed to death in Gaza 2 days before that. And there were suspicions amongst the Arabs that the traffic collision had not been an accident. The day after the traffic deaths, Palestinians throughout the territories exploded with pent-up rage. Observers speculated that Palestinian rioters were motivated in part by a dramatic event that took place the previous month. This was a shocking event in terms of history because a daring attack into Israel by a terrorist, a solo Palestinian hang glider who flew into Israel from Lebanon into an army base and killed 6 Israeli soldiers and wounded several others. Another factor fanning the Palestinian passions had been the recent increase in pressure by Jews to take over Islam's third holiest site, Haram al-Sharif, or the Temple Mount, as the Jews call it, in Jerusalem. This is a part of a conspiracy theory that happens all the time, that the Jews are trying to take over Haram al-Sharif, or maybe even destroy it. The word intifada is used again during the second Palestinian Intifada from 2000 to 2005. This uprising actually is commonly called the Al-Aqsa Intifada. It begins on September 28, 2000. Ariel Sharon appeared at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in the compound in Jerusalem's Old City with more than 1,000 Israeli police. It was a blatant attempt to provoke Palestinians. He repeated a phrase that was broadcast during the 1967 war, during the Six-Day War, when Israeli forces seized Jerusalem itself and reunited the city. And the phrase was actually expressed in the following way: "The Temple Mount is in our hands," Sharon shouted. The Palestinians reacted almost immediately to that, to the threat that Al-Aqsa, their third holiest site, might be taken over by the Israelis. So the Israeli forces launched a series of sweeping military offensives in order to try to crack down and punish the Palestinians for rising up in this second intifada. So it goes back and forth and back and forth. A tremendous amount of violence takes place. The United Nations quickly releases a resolution, 1322, citing Israel for the use of excessive force against the Palestinian people. The resolution came less than 3 weeks after the start of the violence, by which time hundreds of Palestinians had already been killed and even more injured. Now, the silent Intifada. This Intifada gets its name because there's no organized controlling power. The two previous Palestinian Intifadas were well organized and perpetrated by trained leaders and organizers. It is also called the silent Intifada because of the reluctance of the Israeli leadership and the media to call it an intifada. They keep talking about unrest and riots. This silent intifada is commonly agreed to have begun in the summer of 2014, in June, with the kidnapping and the murder of the 3 Israeli teenagers. Following that kidnapping, there was the murder of Mohammed Abu Qaidar. And then in September and October, it became very clear that the whole environment was politically charged, and there was a lot of rioting and other events taking place against the Israelis. As a result, Israeli politicians and news media outlets did not want to pay much attention to these things. They didn't want to feed into an already existing scene of riots, so they didn't call it an intifada. And because of that, because of the lack of sufficient attention to the frequent attacks, it became clear that it was going to be called the silent intifada. Over 152 such violent attacks have taken place in July and August alone. That's what we have figures for. By October, some news sources and other Israeli politicians from both right and left were referring to the wave of these attacks as the third intifada. So now we're getting a whole series of names that are coming out, and it's important. Is it the silent intifada? Is it the third intifada? What is it going to be called? Or is it just a series of riots? From many Israeli analysts' point of view, it can't be called an intifada unless it has certain important elements. The most important element that it has to have is regularity. It has to also be able to be spontaneous or appear spontaneous in multiple places at the same time. In other words, if it's just one series of attacks in Jerusalem and repeatedly in Jerusalem, it's not an intifada. It has to be in various places, happening regularly. That's not what's really happening right now. So the target of many of these attacks actually has been the Jerusalem light rail line. And it runs through the city of Jerusalem itself, threading the needle between Jewish and Arab portions of the city itself. The light rail is one of the main targets because it symbolizes the city of Jerusalem. It also symbolizes Jews and Arabs living together. At any given moment, so says the Light Rail Authority, 30% of the rail cars from the trains are out of service due to non-traditional acts of destruction. In other words, terror acts against property, destruction via terror. Now, while this intifada is certainly being egged on by leaders, there's no tanzim or organized leaders identifying targets or orchestrating demonstrations. This intifada thrives on spontaneity. It can spin out of control, or it can fizzle out at any moment. Or it can linger for a long time, creating a low-level, constant terror and rock-throwing threat. And of course, the current most popular weapon, car attacks. Using the car as a weapon. Talks between Israelis and Palestinians did not lead anywhere, and no progress there, just frustration. John Kerry, the U.S. Secretary of State, attempted a peace initiative earlier this year, but it ran it totally into the ground in March. Both of the parties in negotiations treated the idea of compromise with open indifference, if not open contempt. Israel's military advantage is great, and it has been for decades. Despite the bombardment of rockets and missiles that came out of Gaza by Hamas and her affiliates, and those who were satellites of her, the reality is that Israel has a huge military advantage here. But here is the important point. Past intifadas have proven to be turning points that altered the course of the conflict. A new phase, a phase of attrition, prolonged struggle between Israel and the Palestinians involving both Gaza and the West Bank would certainly have far-reaching but unseen implications. This is particularly the case should there be a long-term disruption of daily life in large swaths of Israel. And if so, Palestinians are thinking that it may be worth their while to foment an intifada. That's why you're hearing the PA leaders, not just Hamas leaders, openly speak about taking back Jerusalem. Abbas recently mentioned the plan to move the Arafat shrine to Jerusalem. Imagine that, Arafat's shrine in Jerusalem. That's a direct and blatant call for people to challenge the status quo and riot. In the past, the previous two intifadas had an impact on two very important groups. The international community embraced the oppressed Palestinians and saw Israel as the oppressor, clear as day. And the Israeli population became exhausted. They just could not continue to live under the constant rocks and terror. The Palestinians and the PA and the people on the street see an intifada as a vehicle to get their points on the table and to get Israel to make concessions. Interestingly, the most powerful force in a spontaneous riot is Mother Nature. When it rains or it's cold outside, fewer people participate. That's a rule, except if they're being paid. The good news here is that the region is in the rainy season, and it's getting darker earlier. And I would guess, and actually predict even, that the weather would put a damper on this silent intifada. Coming up next, points of view. Here's what some important voices have been talking about. First up is a column. It's from the Orlando Sentinel. It's an op-ed in a section called My Word, where local people in Orlando articulate their point of view. Remember, op-eds are referred to as op-eds because they're opposite the editorial. Editorial on one side, they're the opposite side. This is where the word comes from, op-ed, and hence, my word. This op-ed is called Muslims Are Their Own Worst Enemies. The piece is by Norman Berdichevsky. It's published November 9th, 2014. Berdichevsky is a former instructor in Judaic studies. He taught Hebrew at the University of Central Florida. He has a PhD in geography from the University of Wisconsin. The essence of the piece is that Muslims defeat their own cause. He begins, is it any wonder that an overwhelming majority of Americans of all backgrounds continue to support Israel until a more constructive and positive Palestinian Arab leadership emerges to accept the olive branch of peace offered on numerous occasions? Berdichevsky then explains that since World War II, almost, quote, all the significant portion of deaths, mayhem, destruction, and unrest caused have been the result of inter-Muslim disputes, unquote. And then he continues, quote, he says, where Muslims were at risk of displacement under attack in Bosnia, Kosovo, their rescue was made possible only by the efforts of the United States, unquote. I would add here that even now, it's the United States defending Muslims against ISIS, and it was the US that ousted Saddam Hussein. Berdichevsky concludes in his piece, quote, as polls indicate, Israel's flourishing 1.5 million Arab minority population, whatever their legitimate grievances may have been, they may have, would not trade their Israeli citizenship for a Palestinian one in any future state. Remember how dozens of their supporters in Gaza were thrown off rooftops by Hamas executioners who displayed the same Palestinian brotherhood toward alleged collaborators, unquote. That's his piece. Berdichevsky writes a short, pithy piece saying that maybe the Muslims, and certainly the Palestinians, have made some big strategic errors that they should bear responsibility for. The next piece is an editorial from Yated Na'aman, the Hebrew edition. It is the largest ultra-Orthodox paper in Israel. It serves the Lithuanian yeshiva community. The largest ultra-religious paper in Israel, Yated Na'aman, ran an editorial telling Jews not to go up to the Temple Mount and criticize those who do go up. There are those trying to understand the nature of the cause of the rioting in Jerusalem, and there are those who are trying to cast blame. The paper and its readers are a group, And they are saying that Jews going to the Temple Mount is incendiary, explosive. And they are saying that Jews are causing part of the cause of this conflict. They may be correct. To quote the editorial, going up to the Temple Mount is, quote, like throwing a match into an oil well, which will bury the Middle East in smoking ashes. The editorial blasted those Jews who want to access the Temple Mount, saying, quote, they are laying out a red carpet for terrorists, which will only become redder with blood as the tensions are intensified. These people will not be satisfied until they leave behind them and their activities politically scorched earth, and when Jerusalem, which sits on a powder keg, burns with the fires of hatred, unquote. They conclude that the Temple Mount should be officially off limits to Jews in order to maintain order. Quote, the government of Israel must close the Temple Mount to Jews. It is not only a terrible security threat, but more seriously, an awful stumbling block for Jews who may violate one of the most serious prohibitions, unquote. The more serious prohibitions he's speaking of are the laws and demarcations on the Temple Mount, delineating exactly where only certain Jews were permitted in temple times. Stepping in the wrong place is absolutely forbidden, actually punishable by death by rabbinic court. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. All these cartoons come from the Palestinian social media, especially Facebook and Twitter. They've been spread around and around. Finding the original sources very, very difficult. It was impossible for me to find the original sources of these things. But they're spread all over the place and they're posted everywhere. They're making fun of the current conflict, the current Intifada, lending support to killing Jews and killing Israelis. The cartoons actually aggrandize this brand, this new phenomenon in the current conflict. They identify the new weapon as the car. They focus on what we are calling the car intifada. The first cartoon is a play on words. It describes a road with signs and green lights, and a sign symbolizing no with a red strip through the middle, a slash through the middle. That's where the wordplay hinges. The word is driving on the main road. It's in the shape of tires, but it's in Arabic, and it reads da'es, which means to run over in Arabic. The sign, which has a slash through it, is Daesh. Daesh in Arabic is the acronym, the abbreviation for the Islamic State that we call ISIS. In other words, running over Jews and Israelis is our intifada. It's not ISIS. The second cartoon is a picture of a van that was involved in one of the attacks, one of the car intifada attacks. Written on the van is M75. Under that reads, on four wheels in Arabic. In other words, M75 in the Arabic words on four wheels. In other words, the M75 is that long-range missile that Hamas shot into Israel during the past summer, which reached way above Tel Aviv. And of course, on four wheels means that's the weapon, is the car. The third cartoon is a yellow warning sign. Above the sign reads the caption, the car intifada. The yellow sign reads, run them over. This is a very sad and poignant cartoon. It says it all. And that is one of the reasons why some are calling this whole set of riots automobile intifada. The last cartoon is a yellow square. It's like a warning sign, but also is trying to utilize the metaphor of the Hamas flag. The cartoon has a car on it, and the back of the car is the shape of a machine gun. The sign reads, object, or better, confront, even with your car. The cartoon is telling Palestinians to attack Israelis using their car as a weapon. The entire scenario is ugly and nasty. It's a situation which is so problematic because cars are so commonplace. How can you defend against a car or a van or a truck? How can Israel defend itself against these new weapons? In this situation, anyone can become a terrorist and anyone can become a victim. In a moment, my own perspective and a few predictions. I want to think out loud with you now. Menachem Zivotofsky is a 12-year-old boy. He was born in Jerusalem in 2002. Recently, the Supreme Court of the United States heard all about Menachem. His parents want the passport, his U.S. passport, the passport of their son to read Jerusalem, Israel, in the box designating the place of birth. As of now, all U.S. citizens born in Jerusalem simply have the word Jerusalem in their passports. The box for country is blank. In 1995, Congress passed a law clearly stating that Jerusalem was the capital of Israel. In 2002, Congress passed another law saying that the United States should move its embassy to Jerusalem and that the U.S. passport should read Jerusalem, Israel. George Bush signed that law, but the United States administration and State Department argued that adding the word Israel in the passports would undermine U.S. power and interest. Their legal argument is a constitutional one. They claim that foreign policy is determined by the president and that Congress is overstepping its bounds and that the law is unconstitutional. The 60-minute arguments that were argued is the main issue. The case of the Zivotofsky family was eloquently presented, by the way, by Eliza Lewin. It looks like 9 justices are split right down the middle. The swing vote will be Anthony Kennedy. From his questions, he seemed to be truly undecided. Justice Ilana Kagan paralleled this case to the selective vanity license plates. In other words, pro-Israel U.S. citizens would be able to choose Jerusalem, Israel, for their passports, but pro-Palestinian U.S. citizens living there would not be able to say Jerusalem, Palestine on their passports. It could go either way. In June, the decision of the justices will be made public. Next, I want to think out loud with you about the Saudis buying weapons for Lebanon. Lebanon is buying $3 billion worth of arms and weapons from France, but they don't have the money to do that. The weapons are being stockpiled in order to defend Lebanon, once known as the Switzerland of the Middle East, from extremists, all kinds of extremists. Lebanon is indeed a truly problematic state right now. It needs real serious materials to assist them in defending their country. They need defense against ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, in their minds, even against Israel. But Lebanon does not have an extra $3 billion lying around to procure weapons. Saudi Arabia stepped up and plopped down $3 billion in cash, not a loan. It was a gift. The Saudis gave the Lebanese this gift because Saudi sees themselves as the protector of the Sunni world. And Lebanon is caught in the middle of a series of conflict. And the biggest conflict is that between the Sunnis and the Shiites. Despite the current conflict with ISIS, the most dramatic issue confronting the Muslim world is the internal conflict between Sunnis and Shiites. The Sunni Saudis want to ensure that Lebanon is not toppled by Shiite Hezbollah, which is of course supported by Iran. They want to make certain that neither ISIS nor Al-Qaeda move into Lebanon also. We've thought out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know that the word ghetto comes from the Italian word ghettare, which actually means foundry, the place in the city where they would smelt metal and make cannonballs, in this particular case in the Middle Ages. The ghettare, as it's called in Italian, was the place in the city where Venice forced Jews to live when Jews were first permitted to enter the city in the Middle Ages. Hence the term ghetto emerged. It was a smelly, dirty, industrial waste area. Some say that the word slag, which is get in Italian, which is metal industrial waste, in Italian is really the foundation of the word ghetto. But I think ghettare is better there. The first ghetto was created in Venice on April 10th, 1516, for Jews. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV on JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.